Am I the only one that didn't know about London's underworld? A breeding ground for fear and violence. From this murky world emerged a figure shrouded in notoriety. His name? Frankie Fraser. Mad Frankie, as he was called, became synonymous with the brutality of Gangland London. His name alone could silence a room. His reputation? A chilling cocktail of ruthlessness and charm. This was a man who walked with the titans of the underworld. The Kray twins knew his name. They respected his power. But what forged such a man? "1923. The shadow of the Great War still loomed large. In the heart of Lambeth, South London, a boy named Frankie Fraser was born. Life was tough. The streets were his playground. Poverty was his neighbor. The Fraser family, like many others, struggled to make ends meet. Work was scarce. Hope was even scarcer. Young Frankie's world was one of cramped living conditions and the ever-present struggle for survival. School offered little respite. The classroom held little appeal for a boy who yearned for the freedom of the streets. Education seemed irrelevant in a world where survival was the only lesson that mattered. The streets were Frankie's true teacher. He learned to fight before he could read. He learned to steal before he could write. Lambeth was a tough school, and Frankie Fraser was a fast learner. As Frankie grew older, his brushes with the law became more frequent. Petty theft led to more serious offenses. The thrill of getting away with it, the camaraderie of fellow delinquents, it all pulled him deeper into the criminal underworld. Gangs offered a sense of belonging that had been absent in Frankie's life. Here, surrounded by like-minded individuals, he found a purpose. Loyalty, respect, and violence became the cornerstones of his existence. Frankie's reputation grew with each passing day. He was fearless, ruthless even. He quickly earned the respect and fear of his peers. The streets of Lambeth had hardened him, molded him into something dangerous. But the world was about to change. The year was 1939. War had been declared. World War II cast a long shadow over London. The Blitz rained down destruction, turning the city into a battleground. Amidst the chaos and fear, a different kind of opportunity presented itself to those willing to seize it. Blackout nights provided cover for looting and thievery. Rationing created a thriving black market. Frankie, with his street smarts and utter lack of fear, was perfectly positioned to exploit the chaos that had engulfed his city. The war years were a brutal apprenticeship for the young gangster. He learned the art of survival in the harshest of environments. He honed his skills of violence and intimidation. By the time the war ended, Frankie Fraser was no longer a troubled youth. He had transformed into something far more dangerous. He was a hardened criminal, forged in the fires of conflict, ready to carve his own bloody path in the emerging post-war underworld. Post-war London was a city rebuilding itself, but beneath the surface, a different kind of reconstruction was taking place. The criminal underworld was reshaping, with new gangs vying for power. Frankie Fraser, hardened by the war, was drawn to this world like a moth to a flame. He had a reputation, a certain ruthlessness that marked him as someone to be reckoned with. It was this reputation that brought him to the attention of the Richardson Gang. The Richardsons were notorious. Led by the cunning Charlie Richardson, they were involved in everything from protection rackets to armed robbery. They were ruthless, efficient, and they were looking for men like Frankie Fraser. Joining the Richardson Gang was a pivotal moment in Fraser's life. It was a step up from the petty crime of his youth. This was organized crime, with its own set of rules, its own brutal code of conduct, and Frankie Fraser was eager to play his part. Within the ranks of the Richardson Gang, Frankie Fraser quickly rose to prominence. His role? The enforcer. He was the man you sent when a message needed to be delivered, a message written in fear and pain. Fraser's reputation for violence preceded him. He was known for his fists, for the brutal efficiency with which he carried out his duties. He could persuade with a look, intimidate with a word, and if those failed, well, Frankie had other methods. Stories of his brutality began to circulate throughout the underworld. Whispers of his exploits sent shivers down the spines of even the most hardened criminals. He became a figure of morbid fascination, a cautionary tale whispered in hushed tones. Frankie Fraser was the man you sent to collect debts that were long overdue. He was the one who dealt with those who dared to cross the Richardsons. He was the muscle, the enforcer, the bringer of pain, and he excelled in his role. The Richardson Gang's reputation for violence was well earned. They were known for their ruthlessness, their willingness to use any means necessary to maintain their grip on power, and at the heart of their operation was a room that would become infamous, the torture chamber. Located in a nondescript building, this room was where the Richardsons brought those who had crossed them. Debtors, rivals, informants, all were subjected to the same brutal treatment, and Frankie Fraser was often the one tasked with inflicting the pain. The methods used were as varied as they were horrific. Beatings, whippings, electric shocks, anything to extract information or simply to inflict suffering. The torture chamber became a symbol of the Richardson Gang's power, and Frankie Fraser was its most enthusiastic participant. To some, Frankie Fraser was a monster, a sadist who reveled in the suffering of others. To others, he was a necessary evil, a man who did what had to be done in a world where violence was the only language understood. Whatever the truth, one thing was certain. Frankie Fraser's reputation as Mad Frankie was cemented in that room of pain. The nickname Mad Frankie was not given lightly. It was earned through countless acts of violence, through a willingness to go further than anyone else. Frankie Fraser seemed to embrace the moniker, wearing it like a badge of honor. His eyes, once filled with the mischief of a Lambeth Boy, now held a chilling glint. He had stared into the abyss, and the abyss had stared back. And in that exchange, something had changed within him. Frankie Fraser was no longer just a gangster, he was a force of nature. Unpredictable, uncontrollable, and utterly ruthless. He had become a legend in the underworld, a name whispered with a mixture of fear and grudging respect. But even legends have their rivals. And in the shadowy world of London's underworld, a new power was emerging. A pair of brothers, as charming as they were deadly, were making a name for themselves. The Kray twins were about to collide with Mad Frankie Fraser, and the results would be explosive. The Kray twins, Ronnie and Reggie. Their names alone were enough to send shivers down the spines of even the most hardened criminals. They were the new kids on the block, but they were quickly making a name for themselves as a force to be reckoned with. Their rise to power was as meteoric as it was ruthless. They had a vision, a desire to rule the underworld, and they were prepared to use any means necessary to achieve their goals. They were ambitious, charismatic, and utterly without mercy. The Krays and the Richardsons, two gangs vying for control of London's underworld. It was inevitable that their paths would cross, that their ambitions would clash. And at the heart of this brewing storm was Frankie Fraser. Fraser, the notorious Mad Frankie, was a key player in the Richardson Gang. He was their enforcer, their weapon, the man they unleashed when they needed to make a statement. And the Krays knew it. They respected his reputation, even as they plotted to usurp his bosses. The tension between the two gangs erupted in a brawl at the Blind Beggar pub in Whitechapel. Blood was spilled and scores were settled. Frankie Fraser was in the thick of it. George Cornell, a Kray associate, lay dead. The brawl sent shockwaves through the underworld. The Krays vowed revenge and the Richardsons prepared for a fight. Frankie Fraser's relationship with the Kray twins was complex. A tangled web of respect, rivalry, and grudging admiration. They were cut from the same cloth, these men of violence, but their paths diverged as often as they intersected. There were times when their interests aligned, when they found themselves on the same side of a fight. But there were also periods of intense rivalry, when their ambitions clashed and their paths collided in a shower of sparks. Despite their differences, there was a grudging respect between Fraser and the Krays. They recognized in each other a shared experience, a deep understanding of the brutal world they inhabited. They were all products of their environment, shaped by the poverty and violence of post-war London. In the end, Frankie Fraser's relationship with the Kray twins was a microcosm of the underworld itself, a volatile mix of alliances and betrayals, of respect and rivalry, of violence and uneasy truces. It was a dangerous game they played, a game where the stakes were high and the consequences were deadly. And Frankie Fraser, with his penchant for chaos and his reputation for brutality, was right at home in the heart of it all. For a man who lived life on the edge, prison was an inevitable destination, and Frankie Fraser was no stranger to the cold, unforgiving walls of Her Majesty's prisons. His crimes, ranging from robbery to grievous bodily harm, earned him a revolving door policy with some of Britain's most notorious institutions. Life inside was a far cry from the glamour and excitement of London's underworld. The days were long, the nights even longer. The air was thick with tension, a palpable sense of danger lurking in every shadow. But even within these confines, Frankie Fraser's reputation preceded him. To the wardens, he was a problem inmate, a volatile element in an already combustible environment. To his fellow prisoners, he was a figure of awe and fear, a living legend who commanded respect with a look or a word. Prison was a breeding ground for violence, and Frankie Fraser, despite finding himself confined, was never one to shy away from a fight. He was involved in numerous altercations, his fists and his reputation serving him well in the brutal hierarchy of prison life. Confinement did little to dampen Frankie Fraser's spirit. His mind, always active, was constantly searching for an opportunity, a weakness to exploit. Escape became an obsession, a way to thumb his nose at the authorities and reclaim the freedom he craved. His attempts were daring, some would say foolhardy, but they were always meticulously planned. He studied the routines, identified the weak links, and waited for his moment to strike. Tunnels were dug, identities were stolen, and chaos was embraced. While not all of his attempts were successful, each one added to the legend of Mad Frankie Fraser. He became known for his audacity, his unwavering determination to break free from the shackles of prison life. His exploits, often recounted in hushed tones within the prison walls, served as a source of inspiration for some, a cautionary tale for others. Frankie Fraser, even in captivity, refused to be just another inmate. He was a force to be reckoned with, a man who challenged the very notion of confinement. Years turned into decades, and Frankie Fraser's life became a cycle of crime, punishment, and brief moments of freedom. The harsh realities of prison life took their toll, etching lines on his face and hardening his resolve. Yet even within the confines of prison, he found ways to exert his influence. He became a mentor to some, a voice of authority in a world governed by its own brutal code. His advice was sought after, his approval craved. Frankie Fraser, the man who had once terrorized the streets of London, became an institution within the very institutions that sought to contain him. He was a survivor, a man who had stared into the abyss and emerged, perhaps not unscathed, but unbroken. His time in prison, though far from rehabilitative, had a profound impact on Frankie Fraser. It shaped his worldview, hardened his resolve, and cemented his status as a true icon of the British underworld. He had become a living legend, a man whose name would forever be synonymous with the violence, the chaos, and the undeniable allure of London's dark underbelly. The year was 1988. After decades in prison, Frankie Fraser tasted freedom once more. He emerged into a world that had moved on without him. London, once ruled by him, was now awash in neon lights. But Mad Frankie was not easily forgotten. His reputation followed him like a shadow. Whispers started as soon as he entered a pub. He inspired both fascination and fear. Fraser found himself thrust into the spotlight. The media hounded him for interviews. Everyone wanted a piece of Mad Frankie. Fraser embraced his newfound notoriety. He regaled journalists with tales of his exploits. He became a sought-after guest on talk shows. Emboldened by his newfound platform, Frankie Fraser embarked on a new chapter in his life, that of a published author. His autobiography, aptly titled Mad Frank, hit the shelves in 1990, sending shockwaves through British society. Here, in stark detail, were the stories that had only been whispered in pubs and prison cells. Fraser held nothing back. He wrote with a brutal honesty, recounting his crimes with a chilling matter-of-factness. He glorified nothing, but he didn't shy away from the brutality that had become his trademark. The book was an instant success, a bestseller that both horrified and fascinated readers in equal measure. He followed up his autobiography with a series of other books, each one delving deeper into the murky world of organized crime. He wrote about his rivals, his allies, and the intricate workings of a world that operated outside the law. He became a self-proclaimed expert on the criminal mind, offering insights that were both disturbing and strangely compelling. Fraser's transformation from hardened criminal to best-selling author was as unexpected as it was controversial. Some lauded him for his honesty, for providing a raw and unfiltered glimpse into a world that was usually shrouded in secrecy. Others condemned him for profiting from his crimes, for glorifying a life of violence. Despite the controversy that swirled around him, Frankie Fraser remained unapologetic. He refused to express remorse for his actions, claiming that he was simply a product of his time, a man who had played by the rules of a brutal game. He had no regrets, he declared, only memories. He seemed to revel in his infamy, attending book signings with an almost childlike glee. He posed for photographs, his eyes twinkling with a mixture of mischief and menace. He signed autographs with Mad Frankie, his signature scrawled across the page like a badge of honor. Fraser's lack of remorse angered many, particularly the families of his victims. They saw him as a man who had escaped true justice, a man who was profiting from his brutality. They demanded apologies, reparations, some form of acknowledgement of the pain he had inflicted, but their pleas fell on deaf ears. Frankie Fraser remained unmoved, his conscience seemingly untroubled by the suffering he had caused. He was a man who lived by his own code, a code forged in the fires of poverty, violence, and decades spent behind bars. The shadow remains. On a cold November day in 2014, Frankie Fraser, aged 90, finally succumbed to the one opponent he couldn't outwit or outfight: time. His death marked the end of an era, the closing chapter on a life that had become synonymous with London's underworld. News of his passing was met with mixed reactions. Some mourned the loss of a true London character, a man who, despite his flaws, had become an unlikely icon. Others felt only a sense of relief, the knowledge that a dark chapter had finally come to an end. Frankie Fraser's legacy remains complex and contested. Was he a ruthless gangster who terrorized London for decades? Or was he a product of his environment, a man who had simply played the hand he was dealt? The answer, like the man himself, is shrouded in shades of grey. Love him or loathe him, there's no denying that Frankie Fraser left an indelible mark on London's history. His story serves as a stark reminder of a darker time, a time when violence lurked in every shadow, and men like Mad Frankie were the undisputed kings of the underworld. A life in black and white. Frankie Fraser's story is not one of redemption. It's a story painted in shades of grey, a stark look at London's underbelly. He lived a life of violence, loyalty, and brutal honesty. From Lambeth streets to prison cells, Fraser's journey was survival. He fought in a world where respect was earned through fear. Loyalty could kill or save you. He was a product of post-war London's harsh realities. Fraser made no apologies for his life. He was a gangster, an enforcer, living by a code few understood. He embraced the darkness with open arms. But there was more to him than brutality. Fraser was charismatic, intelligent, and a natural storyteller. His tales of the underworld fascinated and repelled. Was Frankie Fraser born bad, or was he a product of his circumstances? It's a question that continues to be debated, a moral maze with no easy answers. Some argue that he was destined for a life of crime from the moment he was born, that the poverty and violence of his upbringing left him with no other choice. Others believe that Fraser had a choice, that he could have chosen a different path, but the allure of power, the thrill of violence, proved too strong to resist. He became addicted to the adrenaline rush of a life lived on the edge, the respect and fear that followed him like a shadow. The truth, as always, likely lies somewhere in between. Frankie Fraser was a complex man, shaped by a complex set of circumstances. He was a product of his time, a man who lived by the rules of a brutal game. Perhaps the answer doesn't matter. Perhaps it's more important to understand the world that created him, the world that allowed men like Frankie Fraser to thrive. It's a world that still exists, even if it's hidden beneath a veneer of respectability. And it's a world that continues to produce its fair share of monsters. Frankie Fraser is gone, but his legend lives on. He was London's shadow, a reminder of the city's capacity for both great good and great evil. He was a walking contradiction, a man who could inspire both fear and admiration. Frankie Fraser was London's sun, for better or worse.